She once played the woman who was betrayed. Now, in the quiet of her real life, she knows what it means to betray herself. At 60, Diane Lane no longer walks red carpets like she used to. She walks grocery aisles. She walks empty living rooms. She walks through silence. There's a certain ache that settles into a woman's bones when the world no longer looks back at her with desire-only memory. And Diane feels it, not loudly, but constantly, like the soft ticking of a wall clock in a house that hasn't heard laughter in a while. Once, she was called the new Grace Kelly. At 13, she stood across from Laurence Olivier and left him speechless. At 18, she graced the cover of Time magazine. At 37, she delivered a performance so raw, so wordless, that it stopped audiences cold a single train ride. No dialogue, just breath, shame, and trembling hands. And yet, she never won an Oscar, never had a public redemption arc, never became the myth Hollywood promised to build for her. She was the perfect lover on screen, but never quite loved enough off it. She played the broken wife, while hiding her own breaking behind closed doors. She gave the world her youth, her face, her silence, and received in return a spotlight that blinked off too soon. In 2005, Diane admitted she'd had affairs. A decade earlier, she'd called the police on her husband. And all this from a woman who spent years being cast as the moral center, the faithful, the noble, the one who never strayed. But the truth, Diane Lane strayed. And somehow that made her more real than any role she ever played. This isn't a story about scandal. It's a story about what's left after the applause fades. About a woman who once belonged to the world and now only belongs to her own fragile quiet. Before we begin, take a breath, because this isn't just a biography. This is what regret sounds like when it's told not through words, but through a single, tired glance from a woman who has lived too much and spoken too little. Diane Lane never had a room of her own. She grew up in the backseat of a bomb, the daughter of a broken marriage and 2 broken dreams. Her father, Burton, was a stage actor turned taxi driver, equal parts philosophy and instability. Her mother, Colleen, was a nightclub singer who once posed for Playboy, then vanished to Mexico shortly after Diane was born. They separated when she was just 13 days old. By the time she was 6, her mother gave up custody entirely. From that moment on, it was Diane and her father against the world, drifting from one low-rent hotel to another, always on the move, always unfinished. There was no dinner table, no bedtime story, just theater rehearsals, cramped kitchens, and the hum of streetlights through dusty windows. Her father could quote Dostoevsky but forget to feed her. He could perform a Shakespeare to an empty room but couldn't pay the gas bill. He loved her deeply but loved his chaos more. And Diane learned early if she wanted peace, she'd have to create it herself. At 15, she ran away, not from pain, but from the exhausting weight of someone else's version of love. She boarded a plane to Los Angeles with her co-star, Christopher Atkins. She thought it would be freedom. But when she returned, something far worse happened. Her mother, the one who had once walked away, returned out of nowhere and took her to Georgia. Against her will. No warning, no discussion. A mother who had abandoned her, now claiming her like lost luggage. For 6 weeks, Diane lived in a small southern town with a grandmother she barely knew, a preacher. Strict and silent. There were no scripts, no cameras, just canned meat, broken lawnmowers, and a silence so thick it hurt to breathe. When her father sued for custody and won, she returned to New York. But something inside her never did. She stopped trusting anyone who said, "I know what's best for you." She learned to make decisions with quiet urgency. She finished high school by mail, paid her own rent, slept with a knife under her pillow. The media would later call her mysterious, reserved. But the truth was simpler than that. She was a girl who had learned, far too young, that no one was coming to save her. And maybe that's why, even decades later, Diane Lane still flinches when someone offers help, as if kindness is just a softer kind of trap. She didn't audition. She was seen at 13 years old. Diane Lane wasn't trying to become famous. She was just a girl on stage, performing in Runaways at the public theater, her eyes already carrying more world weariness than any child should. Director George Roy Hill sat in the audience, and something about her made him stop breathing. He cast her on instinct. No callback, no test reel. Just a feeling this girl doesn't act, she just is. That decision led her to A Little Romance, opposite Laurence Olivier, a man who had shared scenes with the greatest actors who ever lived. But when Diane entered the room, he didn't see a child. He saw an equal. He called her the new Grace Kelly, and he meant it. The movie took her to Paris, to magazine covers, to the bright, brutal center of Hollywood's attention. She was 14 and already being hailed as the future of American cinema. A year later, Time magazine put her face on the cover. Hollywood's whiz kids. She hadn't even finished high school. But there's a cruel thing that happens to girls who shine too early. The world stops seeing them as girls. She was paired romantically with every male co-star in tabloids, in whispers, in suggestions she never invited. A single glance with Matt Dillon on screen, the press wrote them as lovers. A tender smile with Richard Gere. Suddenly, they were inseparable. Diane wasn't dating. She was acting. But no one wanted to believe that. By 18, she had worked with Coppola in 3 films: The Outsiders, Rumblefish, The Cotton Club. She was a millionaire before she could vote, and then she disappeared. The girl they called a prodigy simply vanished from headlines. Critics whispered, she peaked too early. Hollywood turned the page not because she failed, but because she stopped playing the part they wrote for her, the dream girl, the innocent, the delicate muse. But Diane had grown tired of being looked at and never listened to. She stepped away, not in scandal, but in silence. She said no to scripts that asked for her body but not her voice. She chose privacy over press, stillness over survival games. And maybe that's what saved her, even if it also cost her the kind of fame that never fades. Because Diane Lane was never interested in being famous. She only ever wanted to be real. And in Hollywood, that's often the quickest way to disappear. She said nothing, and the world listened. In Unfaithful 2002, Diane Lane played Connie, a wife, a mother, a woman slowly unraveling in a marriage too still, too quiet, too perfect to scream. But it wasn't the affair that made the movie unforgettable. It was what came after. That moment on the train, no words, no sex. Just a woman sitting alone, trembling, breathing like every breath hurt. Her hands touched her lips. Her eyes refused to settle. She wasn't weeping. She wasn't smiling. She was coming undone. And somehow, in under 60 seconds, Diane Lane reminded Hollywood why she had always mattered. That scene wasn't in the script. It wasn't rehearsed. Director Adrian Lyne just pointed the camera and said, roll something in. And Diane, in her quiet brilliance, delivered a masterclass in grief, guilt, and longing, all without speaking a single word. Critics called it iconic. Actors studied it. Audiences sat still in theaters, unable to look away. She was nominated for an Academy Award, but the nomination wasn't what mattered. What mattered was that Diane had done the impossible. She had taken back her story. For 2 decades, she had been typecast the sweetheart, the lover, the woman you remember but never understand. Now she had stepped into a role no actress wanted. Not because it was controversial, but because it was too honest. Connie wasn't evil. She was lonely. She wasn't searching for sex. She was searching for herself. And Diane Lane, in portraying that quiet ache, tapped into something far deeper than infidelity. She gave voice to millions of women who had sat in cars, in kitchens, in bathrooms, asking themselves, is this all there is? She didn't scream. She didn't ask for sympathy. She simply broke, beautifully, and it changed everything. From that moment on, Diane was no longer the girl who faded. She was the woman who returned older, wiser, flawed, and finally real. She didn't win the Oscar that year, but she won something better. A second life in film, one not built on fantasy but on truth. And the truth was this: you don't need to speak to be unforgettable. You just need to feel it deeply enough that the silence does the talking for you. There are two kinds of love stories: the ones that break quietly and the ones that bruise out loud. Diane Lane had both. She met Christopher Lambert in Paris, 1984, the kind of meeting you'd expect in a movie, not in real life. She was young, luminous, already bruised by childhood but still soft at the edges. He was the rising European star, charismatic, gentle, curious about her in a way that felt real. No red carpets, no press, just two people passing handwritten letters across oceans, falling in love between film shoots and long-distance calls. In 1988, they married, quietly. In 1998, their daughter Eleanor was born, the one person Diane would later call my anchor in a world that keeps drifting. But even fairy tales can wear thin. They lived on different continents, spoke different artistic languages, and slowly what had once felt fated began to feel fatigued. In 1994, they divorced without scandal, without cruelty, just a whisper of goodbye between two people who couldn't hold on to what once held them. And yet, even decades later, whenever people mention Diane Lane and marriage, it's his name they remember. Because maybe we never forget the first person who saw us clearly before the world made us hide. But her second love story was louder. Josh Brolin, magnetic, rugged, a man with his own shadows. They married in 2004, and 4 months later, Diane called the police. She never pressed charges, called it a misunderstanding. But the word hung in the air like smoke from a fire no one wanted to name. He had a temper. She had silence, and silence, when paired with volatility, becomes its own kind of violence. Over the years, arrests followed bar fights, drunken nights, headlines. Diane never spoke against him, never played the victim. She simply endured. In 2013, they divorced. No statements, no bitterness, just done, Josh would later say. Only Diane could explain it, but she chose not to. And I respect that. And maybe that's the most Diane Lane thing of all. To walk away without a scream, to let pain be private, to survive with dignity instead of drama. But what's left when the world sees your face and forgets your wounds? 2 marriages, 1 child, and a heart that had loved enough to know when it had reached its limit. Diane Lane didn't give up on love. She gave up on pretending it didn't hurt. And maybe that's stronger than staying. For decades, Diane Lane was the woman people wanted to believe in. Graceful, private, loyal. She played the betrayed. She played the heartbroken. She played the one who always stayed. And then, in 2005, she whispered a sentence that changed everything. I had affairs with both Timothy Hutton and Christopher Atkins. No scandal, no excuse, just truth dropped like glass onto a floor no one expected her to crack. It wasn't the names that shocked people. It was the fact that she said it. Diane Lane, the woman whose image had been polished into porcelain, now confessing that she too had once reached outside the lines. In a world that loves to divide women into categories, the saint or the sinner, the faithful wife or the reckless other, Diane's admission didn't fit. She wasn't bragging. She wasn't begging for forgiveness. She simply told the truth. And in doing so, she did something far more radical than any tabloid could handle. She made herself human. For years, she had lived inside a script written by everyone but her. Men fell in love with the version of her that existed on screen, luminous, loyal, just fragile enough to be desired. Women saw her as the quiet survivor, the elegant proof that you could be good and still endure heartbreak. And yet, there she was, peeling it all back, revealing a woman who had once been lonely, tempted, imperfect, and brave enough to say it out loud. Some fans turned away. Others leaned in closer. Because for the first time, Diane Lane wasn't just playing a woman who made a mistake. She was that woman. And maybe that's why she never offered an apology. Not because she wasn't sorry, but because she refused to feed a machine that only loved her when she was flawless. She had spent her life acting with subtlety, silence, restraint, but this one moment, this one confession was her loudest performance. Not on screen, not for a role, just as herself. And in that instant, Diane Lane did what so few in Hollywood ever dare to do. She stopped being a symbol and became a soul. The camera stopped rolling, and Diane Lane didn't wait for applause. She walked off set and chose to live, not as a star, not as a symbol, but as herself, flawed, quiet, invisible when she wanted to be. While other actresses chased relevance, she chased stillness. She never launched a lifestyle brand, never curated a perfect Instagram life, never told the world how to age gracefully. She just aged and let it show. At 60, Diane Lane lives in an old house with antique furniture she restores by hand. She practices yoga. She rides horses. She walks. A lot. There's no entourage, no bodyguards, just her, the dirt path, and the sound of her own breathing. She makes her daughter Eleanor breakfast when she visits, wears socks that don't match, burns toast sometimes, smiles when she gets it right the second time. In interviews, she laughs at her own image. I'm great at pretending to cook on screen. She once joked, in real life, I've brought home takeout and faked it like I made in it. No shame, no performance, just a woman who no longer needs to be anyone but who she is. And maybe that's why the industry doesn't quite know where to place her anymore. She doesn't beg for roles. She doesn't play the youth card. She doesn't shout her worth. She just waits for the right character, the right script, the right truth. And when it comes, she gives it everything. She once said acting isn't about being seen. It's about making people feel less alone. Maybe that's why she's never had a meltdown in public, why she never lashed out when misunderstood, why she never tried to reclaim the spotlight that slowly faded from her. Because Diane Lane doesn't need a spotlight to shine. She shines in quiet places, in the pauses between dialogue, in the roles that aren't sexy but real, in the long silences of characters who have lived and lived through it. The truth is, she never really disappeared. We just stopped looking in the quiet places. She wasn't the woman you followed on headlines. She was the one you remembered when the room went still and a part of you whispered, I've felt that too. She never chased legacy, but somehow it followed her. Diane Lane was never the loudest actress in the room. She didn't build a brand, didn't reinvent herself with every trend, didn't cry on cue for magazine covers. And yet, people remember her. Because when Diane Lane steps into a scene, she doesn't act, she becomes, not in a showy way, but in the way your mother once stared out the kitchen window after a fight, the way your sister paused before saying, I'm fine, when she wasn't. She played women the world forgets, the wife who loves but can't breathe, the mother who holds it all together until one moment of collapse, the woman at the airport who almost turns back but doesn't. And in each of those silences, in every line delivered with half a breath and a full heart, she reminded us that quiet doesn't mean weak, it means lived. She didn't win the Oscar, but she won the kind of recognition golden statues can't hold, the ache of real people who saw themselves in her. Unfaithful, Under the Tuscan Sun, A Walk on the Moon, Let Him Go. Different decades, different women, but all carried the same invisible weight, longing, regret, endurance. She never tried to play perfect. She played true. And maybe that's why her legacy matters more now than ever in a world full of noise. She whispered, and people listened. There's a scene in Under the Tuscan Sun where her character Frances stands in a crumbling Italian villa, alone, broken, surrounded by everything she didn't ask for. She closes her eyes and breathes. That was Diane Lane's gift to make stillness feel sacred, to remind us that survival isn't always a roar. Sometimes it's just getting up again. Sometimes it's doing the dishes. Sometimes it's choosing not to call the person who hurt you. And in a world obsessed with reinvention, she chose restoration. She didn't rewrite herself. She returned to herself. That is her legacy. Not as a superstar, not as a myth, but as a mirror. For every woman who's ever sat in her car in a grocery store parking lot just trying to gather herself before going home. Diane Lane was you, and maybe that's why she will never fade, because real never goes out of style. There's no curtain call in real life, no standing ovation, just quiet. That's how Diane Lane chose to live her final act, not in farewell tours or tell-all memoirs, but in the kind of silence that feels like peace. She didn't retire. She didn't announce a grand exit. She simply began saying yes only to the things that made her feel alive, and no to everything else. By 60, she had outlived 2 marriages, a scandal, 1,000 assumptions, and 4 decades of being watched. And still she stood, not louder, not shinier, just truer. In 2024, she returned in Feud Capote versus The Swans as Slim Keith. In 2025, she played Martha Croker in A Man in Full with Jeff Daniels, and still to come a crime thriller, Anniversary, where she's not a love interest or a side character. She's the story. Even now, she doesn't ask for center stage. But when she shows up, people pay attention. Because her power was never in being everywhere. It was in being honest when she arrived. You won't find her trending. You won't find her begging to be seen. But every time she appears, there's that feeling again, like opening a letter from someone who knows you well. And maybe in the end, that's the kind of immortality that matters. Not the awards, not the box office numbers, but the quiet nod of someone sitting alone at 2, whispering, she gets it. Her daughter is grown now. Her fame is quiet now. Her soul, perhaps, finally at rest. She collects wildflowers. She rides horses. She reupholsters old chairs, not because she needs to, but because there's something sacred about fixing what others throw away. Maybe that's what she did all along, not just on screen, but in life. She took stories no one wanted: the betrayed wife, the forgotten woman, the one left behind, and gave them breath, not to make them lovable, but to make them seen. And if there's one final lesson in the story of Diane Lane, it's this: you don't have to be loud to leave a mark. You don't have to be perfect to be remembered. You don't have to win to be worth everything. You just have to stay standing, even when no one claps, even when no one's watching, just like she did.